I'm 17. I was born in Britain and I'm of Somali descent. I'm also one of the few living counter-examples to the much professed claim that those of Somali descent are all Muslims, and anyone who isn't is actually an Ethiopian claiming to be Somali. To add insult to the injury to that claim, I'm also an atheist, so I reject the fundamental pillar of Islam. As one would expect, Somalis generally tend to believe that all apostates must be killed and those who are apostates are rejected by their families and the rest of their tribe. I don't know of anybody stupid or brave enough to be an open apostate in Somalia, or even Somaliland for that matter, as any pressure put on the Somali government to spare them is totally ignored, because we're not exactly big on foreign policy, as you'd imagine. I'm not gonna bang on about my life in secondary school, as it's a bit childish and, quite frankly, I don't think it's interesting enough to actually bother talking about. What I will do, however, is talk about my aptitudes towards Islam, and how they've changed throughout my life. I guess a good place to start is my family. My parents divorced when I was very young, and I've lived with my mother for the rest of my life with occasional visits to my father. My mother's side of the family are generally very intelligent, progressive, and relatively liberal Muslims. They value education and aren't misogynistic bastards. Some of my family don't even wear the hijab, nor do they really give a shit about whether one does or not. My father's side, however, are very conservative people with literalistic interpretations of the Qur'an. I don't know them very well, but the reason why I think this will be quite evident later on in this story. I first became properly interested in Islam when my parents sent me to an Islamic school when I was around 8 or 9. I regularly would ask questions about Islam, the meaning of the Qur'an, and the stories of the Prophet Muhammad. However, I started to hate the school, as I believed that they showed more attention to those who were Asian than people of other races. There were times when questions were asked and I was the only one with my hand up, and they wouldn't pick me to answer the question. Considering I was only 9 years old, it's not hard to see why I interpreted it as racism, whether I was right or not. The last straw for me was actually the difficulty of the word accept, as homework assignments given to me were not challenging in the slightest, which led me to request my removal from the school but to my parents. They happily complied, due to their financial situation at the time anyways. I guess I could consider myself slightly above average intelligence at the time. But fast forward to when I was 12 years old, my interest in Islam became stronger as I began to study the meaning of the Qur'an and the Hadith in great detail and widening my knowledge of Islam beyond that of the average child. Of course, I had a literalistic interpretation of the Qur'an, but I was generally against terrorism, as that entailed suicide, which I saw as a lack of sabr, or patience for death. I had unwittingly taken on the Salafi approach to understanding Islam, as I rejected blindly following the madhab, or the schools of thought, that many Sunni Muslims followed. I was, however, justified in this, as many quotes by imams such as Shafi'i have been recorded saying, "If you find anything wrong with what I'm saying and your evidence contradicts me, follow your evidence, i.e. the Qur'an or the Hadith, or something to that effect." When my knowledge became great enough, I started to go into internet chat rooms with voice over IP so I could use my microphone, and I debated with fellow Muslims and those who weren't. I became somewhat famous in the rooms as I went to, as times I gave da'wah, which is basically preaching for hours and hours to those who were 3 times my age. Some of my views consisted of things like listening to music and watching movies and TV being haram, women being permissibly forced to wear hijab and beaten until they do, it being permissible to beat your wife, and extremist bullshit such as it being permissible to kill every single Jew that resides in Israel, or condoning those who bomb buses and trains without actually killing themselves. My father once recorded me talking about killing all the Jews in Israel, which I really need to fucking destroy. I sort of hate my father for not turning me away from these extremist views, but instead encouraging me to hold on to them by referring to me affectionately as Sheikh, which is basically teacher or old man. This continued for about 3 years, as my school life generally consisted of preaching Islam to those who weren't Muslim, demanding prayer facilities in my school, which was predominantly Asian and Muslim, and condemning female Muslims for not wearing hijab. I began to lose my devotion to the religion when I was about 15, as I started listening to music, watching films and TV, and not praying as much as I used to, which was 5 times a day with the respective sunnat and the wafil and witr, which are the optional prayers which the Prophet Muhammad prayed. I still participated in Islamic debates, however, and whenever I came across them, I generally won them, as my knowledge of Islam was superior to those of my peers at the time. Though about 1.5 years ago, when I was around 16, I had a realization. Unfortunately, it wasn't a divine one, as the realization was that all my belief in Islam was based upon one assumption, that God exists. I guess you could call this anti-divine, but this was a distressing fact nonetheless. I needed to prove this assumption, and this led me to philosophy, so I began to study the works of those such as Kant, Plato, and Jean-Paul Sartre. I began to examine arguments against God such as the problem of evil, the omnipotence paradox, and built refutations to them. I then looked to those for God and examined their validity, and only really found solace with the cosmological argument. Of course, I wasn't aware of some of the glaring errors with this argument, but I never cared. I did realize, however, that religion wasn't a definitive fact. I could only very badly justify God's existence, but not any specific religion's validity. I looked to Pascal's wager to solve this, again not looking at his glaring errors. So I picked 6 religions and rolled a 6-sided die. Guess what religion I got? That's right, Al-Islam. And all this will be reflected in future videos. 6 months later, after studying more philosophy and getting into discussions with a very good friend of mine, I then realized that knowledge pertaining to God's existence is uncertain. You cannot know whether God exists or not, and anyone who claims to is intellectually dishonest. You can probabilify God's non-existence, however, similar to the fact you can probabilify the non-existence of an infinitesimally small, immeasurable teapot orbiting Saturn's rings, or Jupiter if you prefer, but you cannot be absolutely 100% certain. So I decided not to believe in God's existence as a result of my following agnosticism, and thus I became an agnostic atheist. Again, this will be reflected in future videos, and I'll give a more detailed refutation to my previous views. So that leaves me as a disgusting murtad, hiding within the midst of a Muslim family, lying to them constantly about my faith in Allah, and feeling slightly guilty about it. Though I realize that I am still financially dependent on them, and I cannot risk my university education on the chance of being kicked out of my home. Though I must state that I'm not trying to portray myself as some young protege. I'm just recalling how I used to think and what I thought about my own views. I'm sure that it's not typical amongst children to study Qur'an and Hadith in detail, so that's why I stated that my knowledge is far superior than the average child at the time, or was far superior rather. And about the characterization of the terms agnostic and atheist, we can argue about that all day, but if you rather, I'd say I'm a weak atheist. Though I'll reflect, well, my views on this will be reflected in the future videos too. Peace.